Hello and welcome to this edition of The Interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons. Coup d'etat, people's revolution, call it what you will. The extraordinary series of events that have unfolded in Ukraine these last few weeks have dominated the international news. This is not a fight between Russia and the West, insists US Secretary of State John Kerry. It's not a zero-sum game. But does the Kremlin agree? Well, joining me now to answer that and other questions about Russian foreign policy is Nina Khrushcheva, who's a professor in the graduate program of international affairs at the New School in New York and a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute, where she directs the Russian project. She's the author of Imagining Nabokov, Russia Between Art and Politics, and the forthcoming book, The Lost Khrushchev, A Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind. Well, thanks very much for being on the interview.
Thank you.
Not a zero-sum game, says John Kerry, but that's not how Vladimir Putin sees things, is it?
It's not. Vladimir Putin sees everything as a zero-sum game. He always believes that if Russia has one up, that is good for Russia, so somebody has one down. It's not so much about negotiation, but who actually blinks first. And that has been Vladimir Putin's policy for almost 14 years he has been in power, although it has increased in the last few years, and Ukraine is one of those examples.
But this is his nightmare scenario in a way, isn't it? Because it looks like he's losing at the moment.
Well, Vladimir Putin is very lucky. He really is a lucky guy. For example, he was able to build up a bit of a Russian economy that was very much collapsed in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, not because so much of his great strategies of how to improve the economy, but a lot of it due to the international oil prices, high oil prices. So it does seem to be the same thing with Ukraine. He did invest in the wrong partner, and it does seem to be another trait of Putin. He invests in wrong partners, for example, Bashar al-Assad of Syria or Viktor Yanukovych of Ukraine.
The wrong partner, at least according to Western perceptions.
Well, but even according to normal perceptions, to human perceptions, I mean, how could you have a partner like Assad who killed 130,000 people of his own people? The same thing with Yanukovych. It seemed like it was working for Putin. Yanukovych was able to maneuver between the protesters and his own state and his own power. But we saw last week how quickly Yanukovych collapsed and ran away, and we still don't know where he is, whether he could be found or not. So it does seem in these terms Putin was losing because he just had Yanukovych with him in Sochi saying, well, I'm standing by my man, Yanukovych, and he's with me. And then suddenly Yanukovych disappeared, and the whole slew of Russian TV, which is state TV basically, saying Yanukovych is a traitor to his people, not to the protesters, but to those who try to protect the state. But then he's not losing at the same time because the way it is shown, Crimea, the island on sort of this peninsula on the Black Sea, now allegedly wants to join Russia and become part of Russia.
I'll come to Crimea in just a second. But if we go back to November, December, when Yanukovych refused to sign on to the association agreement that had been proposed by the European Union, it seemed at the time, in fact, it was the case, that Russia, or Putin's Russia, was jubilant. But the factor that he didn't take into account, and perhaps is a common feature of his foreign policy, is he didn't take into account the people, Ukrainian people. And that's perhaps what has backfired against him in this case.
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't take people into the account because he is a Soviet-trained man, and he still believes in that formula that people are heard and you just have to tell them what to do and they will do what you do. He also didn't understand, and that's actually surprising to me because he's a very, very clever man, that Ukraine is not Russia. And he already had evidence of Ukraine in 2004 with the Orange Revolution that the people overthrew Yanukovych at the time. And so I think Putin miscalculated, maybe because he himself has spent too much time in the Kremlin and got very much divorced from reality. So in this sense, he was winning, but then he lost very, very quickly.
It's relatively easy to say what Vladimir Putin doesn't want, it's always much more difficult to guess, ascertain what he does want. What do you think he does want in Ukraine?
I actually don't think it's that difficult, because I come back to the fact that he's a Soviet-trained man. So he does believe that Russia is a glorious country. It's one of the most important countries, if not the most important country in the world. He resents the fact that it's no longer a superpower, and that's what he wants. And so his actions are all according to this formula. You mentioned zero-sum game. That's exactly how the Soviets worked, is that we are going to have as much leverage as we can and either trade it off or pile it up and trade it off later. So that's what Putin does. So he wants the Russian Empire, although he doesn't call it this way.
At this point, let's reveal your own connection, in a way, with Ukraine through your great-great-grandfather, Nikita Khrushchev, who in the 1950s, the beginning of the 1960s, was the leader of the Soviet Union, and the man who transferred the administration of Crimea, the peninsula in southern Ukraine that you referred to just now, to Ukrainian administration. So in a sense, one could perhaps argue that he's responsible to some degree for what's happening now.
In a sense, one might argue that my great-grandfather was responsible for that, because indeed in 1954, he did transfer the possession, or the formal possession of Crimea, to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic versus the Russian Soviet Republic. And there have been arguments as to why he did this, and some people say he was drunk. Well, I just want to set it straight. He was not drunk, and he didn't drink. So that
Really?
was not, no, that was not the case. That was not the case at all. I remember the argument that this were economic reasons. I mean, planned economy, so what kind of economic reasons why would have in the planned economy? One can only wonder. But what the argument was that economically, Crimea was more similar to Ukraine's economy. It's on the south. It's territorially, geographically is more appropriate to have Ukraine as part of Crimea. So he did it in 1954. Yes, Ukraine was his favorite nation. He was not Ukrainian, but he was very fond of it. He worked there. He really liked Ukraine. He wanted to be Ukrainian, which is very unusual for a Russian, because most Russians many Russians look at Ukraine as a small Russia still, Malorussia, as they call it. Yeah. But Khrushchev actually really wanted to be Ukrainian. And so I think some part of that personal connection played into his decision. But at the time...
Race forward 60 years now, and Crimea is being used by the Russians as the weak link.
Oh, absolutely. And all the territories in some ways are being used by the Russians as the weak link. Something that was given up, really now Russians try to claim back, to take back, to say that they may have been theirs. So that is just part of that. That is just part of that strategy. But at the time when it was the Soviet Union, it really didn't matter that much. It was a matter of geography more than anything else, because everybody was part of the same USSR. It became much more relevant in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became a separate republic, a separate state, separate country, no longer a republic. And then, of course, the ports that Crimea has in Kerch and Sevastopol really became a tense point between Ukrainian government and the Russian government of Boris Yeltsin. And so the story, it is much more important story of Crimea as of 1991 than I believe it was from 1954.
But just how important do you think Crimea really is to the Kremlin? Obviously, the big question everybody's asking at the moment, is the Kremlin likely to use force to regain it?
The Kremlin, it's very likely for the Kremlin to use force. Whether the Kremlin is likely to use force in this particular case, we don't know. But there's already been a display of power, the military ship parked right out there. And they've been, the Russian government, the Russian parliament has been saying that, it's means nothing for us to send tanks. We do it all the time. So the question is whether they would they decide to do that or not, whether they can take Crimea with less effort or more effort, whether the Crimea is going to be, whether the call for some Crimeans to become part of Russia continues. And in this, Putin would say, look, I'm just responding to the will of the people. And the Russians already started giving Russian passports to the Crimean population.
A pattern which was used earlier on just before the war with Georgia as
Exactly,
well.
Exactly. So it does seem, coming back to your excellent point on the zero sum, it's the same thing. So in Georgia, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the Russian government was giving passports to these Georgian nationals. And then in 2008, they claimed that they have to defend these Georgian nationals against the government of Mikhail Saakashvili, the Georgian government. So it is entirely possible there would be the same kind of scenario in Crimea, although I believe that Putin may want to have it with less drama and just take it because it has originally been Russian, and so it is.
Okay, very briefly, because we're coming to the end now. Do you think that Vladimir Putin has an end strategy, that he is a strategist who has a goal for Russian foreign policy, or is he simply a tactician who moves from one incident to the next?
I think he's a brilliant tactician. I think he's a lousy strategist, and he does have a goal, and the goal is to see Russia powerful, to see Russia big, and to see Russia that everybody is afraid of.
Okay, thanks very much to our guest, Nina Khrushcheva. That's all we have time for today, but don't go away. More news and headlines to follow on France 24.